Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, I'm going to go over what is changing for Blood Death Knights as we move from Season 3 to Season 4. In most normal World of Warcraft expansions, the final major content patch would linger for an extended period of time compared to earlier expansion patches, and, for a while, we didn't think the situation would be any different for Shadowlands. The content might get a little stale after an extended period of time, but the implication was that extra development time was needed for the next expansion, so any new content would only delay the upcoming expansion. But what if Blizzard could come up with a new major content patch that mostly contained reused old content? So then, only a small fraction of development time would be needed to create it, and there would not be as many Dragonflight delays as a result. Such a thing might be able to keep players occupied for a long enough period of time until the next expansion is released without players checking out completely. Well, that's what they decided to do by splitting patch 9.2 into both a Season 3 and a Season 4. But this is not your normal season with a new raid tier, a new power system, and significant balance changes. There might be a new seasonal Mythic plus affix, yes, but beyond that, we're going to be seeing a lot of old raids and a lot of old dungeons. To be specific, we'll see a rotating combo pack of Shadowlands raids with Castle Nathria, Sanctum of Domination, and Sepulture of the First Ones, complete with some modifications to keep things fresh. While for the dungeons, the new dungeon rotation includes all of the mega dungeons from the last 3 expansions, along with Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot. But while all this content might be nice, what I'm focusing on in this video is not going to be the raids and dungeons themselves, but how Season 4 changes the decisions we are making with our characters, specifically as Blood Death Knights. That being said, a large part of what is changing for Blood Death Knights are the items we have available to us given the raid and the dungeon lineup. So that, in particular, is going to be something we are paying attention to. With that in mind, the remainder of this video will mostly be discussing itemization implications, trinket selection, and weapon selection as we move into Season 4. Before we start talking about specific items, I just wanted to go over a few implications about itemization in Season 4. As a result of 3 raids worth of items being available in Season 4 instead of 1, Season 4 will have a much wider set of item options available from raid than in any previous season, including 7 bosses that drop the equivalent to item level 285 gear from Season 3. Up from the 3 bosses that drop this quality of loot in Season 3 from Sepulture of the First Ones. As such, more than twice as much loot is available at this higher item level than normal, though there are some redundant item slots involved between all of these loot tables, and some of the stat lines might not justify using the higher item level gear at times. That being said, it's worth pointing out that the Domination Shard system will not be re-enabled with this patch. And so, Domination sockets should not be a consideration with Season 4 gear at all. However, the Creation Catalyst and tier set bonuses will still function as they do now in Season 3. Additionally, there are new methods of obtaining raid loot that can be utilized alongside direct drops from the raid bosses themselves and from end-of-the-week rewards from the Great Vault. Killing any raid boss on any difficulty for the first time that week will reward you with an upgrade token for that difficulty that lets you upgrade a raid item to the version appropriate to the raid difficulty you kill a boss on. So, you could upgrade an item from Looking for Raid into a Mythic quality item with 20 Mythic boss kills. This means that every 20 Mythic boss kills can result in a Mythic raid item of your choosing, assuming you have at least some version of that item that you can use to upgrade. Normally, this would be a cause for concern, since the raids rotate on a 3-week rotation, and you would only be able to farm for a specific raid item once every 3 weeks. But a new weapon and trinket vendor will allow you to purchase any trinket or weapon you want from the raid with enough boss kills on any raid difficulty. You are limited to using this vendor only 3 times during Season 4, but unless you are building multiple item sets, that should be more than enough to obtain any weapon or trinkets you want for a single spec. And while there isn't any guaranteed method for obtaining items in other slots, some of the most impactful items from Raid tend to be weapons and trinkets. So, if Season 4 lasted long enough, you could, in theory, kill Mythic Terror Grew 20 times on 20 separate weeks, and you could use the currency from these kills to buy a base item, level Old Warrior's Soul, and then immediately upgrade that item to Mythic item level quality, where you would normally need to farm this item off of Mythic Sylvanas herself, and now you don't even need to kill Mythic Sylvanas at all. Granted, one weird aspect of this system is that it might give players an incentive to clear the raids on all 4 difficulties to farm base items for future upgrades, especially if you are looking to upgrade item slots that are not weapons or trinkets. Altogether, itemization from Raid is going to be much stronger than usual relative to other game modes. So, people who primarily play Mythic Plus should be aware that they will be at more of a competitive disadvantage than usual during Season 4 if they have no plans on Mythic raiding. That being said, it is at least possible to get weapons and trinkets from end bosses at Mythic item level in Season 4, even if you don't kill that boss on Mythic raid difficulty, and cross-realm Mythic raids should be available from the start of the season, if that is any consolation. On the Mythic Plus side of things, dungeon loot is not getting any acquisition improvements at this time, so things will be the same as before with weekly vaults and Valor. The only actual difference is that the item pool will be different due to having different dungeons in the Mythic Plus rotation, and Valor is uncapped from the start of the season. It is not possible to upgrade items from any dungeons not in the rotation, and any of the non-Shadowlands dungeons that are in the rotation will not have a scaled-up Mythic Plus version. So, for example, you can't get a higher item level punch card from Mechgon Junkyard on the baseline Mythic difficulty. Now that we've talked about what loot is available to us and the acquisition systems involved, let's talk about some of the specific item slots. At this time, you may be wondering why I'm singling out trinkets and weapons in particular, without talking about any of the other item slots. However, without any significant balance changes, as well as having the same tier set bonuses and legendary items available to us in Season 4, our current general gearing strategy isn't changing at all from the current season. So, haste remains a particularly valuable stat, while critical strike remains pretty lackluster. However, I did want to highlight a disclaimer I've given in previous videos, as well as in my written guide, when it comes to haste. Most of haste's value in patch 9.2 is associated with the tier set bonus, which causes haste to improve our ability to extend Dancing Rune Weapon, along with having higher uptime on the associated stacking strength buff. However, if you are already in a situation where you can immediately recast Dancing Rune Weapon as soon as it expires, then more haste drops in value from our strongest secondary stat to one of our weakest secondary stats, since it is no longer providing higher uptimes on Dancing Rune Weapon. So, if you commonly find yourself in the situation where you have no downtime between Dancing Rune Weapons, you may want to evaluate for yourself whether you have too much haste. That being said, this does not seem to be a common problem for most players, and realistically, this is only going to be a potential problem for Kyrian Blood Death Knights in a Mythic Plus environment with already very high levels of haste when executed well. Still, since the total amount of secondary stats on our gear will go up with the higher item levels of Season 4, it is possible that this theoretical haste breakpoint becomes more of an issue. In any case, because the secondary stat situation is relatively unchanged in Season 4 from what it is in Season 3, that is why I am only focusing on item slots with unique effects, such as trinkets and weapons. So, back to the topic at hand, let's talk about trinkets. As of Season 3, there are pretty much only 3 types of trinkets we are concerned about: haste trinkets, cheat death trinkets, and Codex of the First Technique. For all intents and purposes, haste trinkets are basically the default option for both of our trinket slots, unless we are in a situation that warrants a different type of trinket. Haste trinkets are generally a very strong choice in all situations for the same reason haste is a strong secondary stat, because our tier set bonus allows haste to increase our Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. And while the previous disclaimer still applies about there being limits to the value of haste, this should not be an issue for many players. As for the haste trinkets themselves, we are generally looking at Celia's Secret Technique, Elegy of the Eternals, and Old Warrior's Soul, despite the fact that Old Warrior's Soul is from the previous raid tier and can have a 19 item level disadvantage. Ignoring Old Warrior's Soul for a moment, Celia's and Elegy are two very similar trinkets with very similar effects, and outside of situations where you are in a Covenant-stacked group, we can generally consider them to be equally powerful. As for Old Warrior's Soul, the main reason it is seeing play this patch is because it has a much higher potential haste value than either Elegy or Celia's, assuming you are able to maintain a high enough average stack count. With only 3 of 5 stacks, Old Warrior's Soul provides more haste than both of the other trinkets, and at the full 5 stacks, it provides tremendously more than the alternatives. Enough so that having 20 less passive strength on the trinket isn't too much of a concern. In Raid, it's fairly safe that you will get enough extra haste from Old Warrior's Soul over the course of a raid encounter to make it superior to the other 2 haste trinkets. Though, in Mythic Plus, it's going to come down to whether or not you have enough success at maintaining your haste stacks between pulls, since if you are out of combat for more than 15 seconds, you will lose all of your current haste stacks while you're in a dungeon. But if you are at least somewhat successful in not losing your stacks after every pull, Old Warrior's Soul will likely provide more haste on average than the alternatives, though Old Warrior's Soul's power may be a little more inconsistent throughout the dungeon as you gain and lose stacks. As for the cheat death trinkets, we are mostly just looking at the Weave of Warped Fates, which is similar to Old Warrior's Soul in that it is a previous raid tier trinket that is stuck at a lower maximum item level, so it will provide less baseline strength as a result. Still, a cheat death effect on an 8-minute cooldown can sometimes be useful, either to provide us with a cheat death effect while we are running the Red Thirst talent, or to provide a second cheat death effect on top of Purgatory when appropriate. Granted, cheat death effects diminish each other, since the second cheat death effect is only going to provide value if you proc a cheat death effect twice within the same 4-minute window. In any case, the main question of concern is what circumstances make this trinket more useful than one of the haste trinkets. In Raid, you would most likely be considering using this trinket with Red Thirst more than anything, since dangerous situations are predictable more times than not. That being said, I do think the fight would have to be especially dangerous to you, personally, to justify using Weave of Warped Fates with Red Thirst over Purgatory with a haste trinket. Or a raid encounter would need to put you into a situation where you are unable to heal out of Purgatory procs for whatever reason. On the flip side, a haste trinket would be devalued if raid mechanics forced you to lose Dancing Rune Weapon at preset times. As for Mythic Plus, Dancing Rune Weapon will easily prevent most deaths up until at least a plus 25 key level in my experiences, and haste trinkets help with Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. Additionally, Purgatory is the default in Mythic Plus. As such, this trinket can only really be justified if you are at a high enough key level where you are at a particularly high risk of dying to burst damage while Dancing Rune Weapon is active. While I do think someone could start making this argument for using this as a trinket starting at a plus 28 key level in the current season, I'm not completely sold on it being better than a haste trinket even at those key levels. Still, it's an option for Mythic Plus that is available for consideration. Finally, we have Codex of the First Technique, which is a very unique trinket. First, keep in mind that this is a stamina trinket instead of a strength trinket, so if we were to look at the difference from a 272 item level stamina trinket versus a 272 item level strength trinket on my own character, the stamina effect is providing around 5.9% more effective health, while the strength effect is providing around 5.2% more damage. So this is going to be an important difference to keep in mind before we even begin talking about trinket active effects. As for the trinket active effect for Codex of the First Technique, it's basically a 10% damage reduction effect whenever the buff is active, and any damage you take is reflected to its source, equal to the damage that was reduced. Yes, there is technically a cap on how much can be reduced and reflected from any one hit, but realistically, the cap is high enough that it mostly isn't a factor. And while the uptime depends on how much haste you have, you can get uptime on this effect to be greater than 50% uptime if you are actively being damaged. Furthermore, incoming damage is reduced in such a way that the damage reduced is still factored into Deathstrike healing, which heals based on the amount of damage you have taken in the last 5 seconds. This last detail makes Codex relatively more valuable for Blood Death Knights, and to a lesser extent Vengeance Demon Hunters, compared to other tanks, since Deathstrike is a significant portion of our overall mitigation. If you wanted to think about this another way, this interaction is equivalent to gaining around 5% more Deathstrike healing compared to a situation where the damage reflection effect did not contribute to Deathstrike healing in this way. So, overall, we have a trinket that provides a certain amount of healing and damage per second based on the damage you are taking, while also providing around 11.5% effective health on average. For raid, this trinket could be an option, but it is likely only worthwhile in fights where you are taking oppressively high amounts of incoming damage, which, coincidentally, also tend to be fights where the effective health benefits are also providing at least some value. Still, there probably aren't many fights that have high enough incoming damage in raid for this trinket to be optimal, so just keep that in mind. For Mythic Plus, the tank generally takes more incoming damage than on similar difficulty raid content, generally making the healing and damage effects stronger on their own. That being said, while Codex is capable of dealing considerable damage, especially at higher key levels, we are almost never taking this trinket for damage reasons alone, since any damage we gain from the trinket effect needs to overcome the damage we lose from this trinket providing no baseline strength. If you remember, the strength on a normal strength trinket, without including its effect, would be giving me around 5% more damage, which is something that this stamina trinket is not providing. In any case, Mythic Plus dungeons also tend to have a much more unpredictable incoming damage pattern, along with their higher incoming damage levels, meaning that the extra effective health is particularly valuable in this content type given a high enough key level for your current gear level. If it is not preventing outright deaths, it is at least providing you with more room to dip to lower health levels so your death strikes can heal for more. In general, I would say that you want to at least be at the plus 23 key level or above before considering this trinket. Otherwise, the overall benefits of this trinket may not be sufficient to justify using it over a haste trinket. Moving into Season 4, we have a few more trinket options to consider. First, before we get into some of the new trinket options, it's important to note that Old Warrior's Soul and Weave of Warped Fates will now be available at competitive item levels, so both of these trinkets will be relatively stronger in Season 4 than they are now in Season 3. Both trinkets will continue to have very similar usage conditions, but the increase in relative power is something to keep in mind. First, let's start talking about the Splintered Heart of Alar, which is a very similar trinket to Weave of Warped Fates. And for the purposes of this discussion, let us take a look at the tooltip for two versions of these trinkets that have identical item levels. In truth, there isn't really much that is all that different with these trinkets, but they have two main differences. One, they heal back in a slightly different manner, so one of these trinkets may heal you back to a higher health total than the other when procced. However, it's completely situational as to which trinket will heal you for more when it procs. Second, the Splintered Heart of Alar will deal AoE damage when it procs as an extra effect. On one hand, this means that the Splintered Heart of Alar can result in some extra damage, but on the other hand, this AoE effect can hit nearby allies as well as enemies, so you run the risk of killing your allies whenever you proc this trinket. There's no clear winner when you directly compare these trinkets, so which one you use would ultimately come down to player preference. However, I'd be a little worried about Alar's friendly fire damage myself if I had to choose between the two. As for Aegis, it's important to note that this trinket is all about defensive uptime, and it has never been a particularly strong source of healing or damage, at least for Blood Death Knights. Blood Spattered Scale would usually result in more overall healing and damage than Aegis, even in Season 2. Also, given how the trinket functions, it is only really effective when you are taking a large number of individual attacks during the duration. If you are not in this situation, the trinket effect is going to be very weak. Back in Season 2, this trinket was mostly competing with Blood Spattered Scale, Reactive Defense Matrix, and Codex of the first technique for its trinket slot, but not only will haste trinkets be significantly stronger in Season 4, but our high dancing rune weapon uptime means that less melee attacks are actually hitting us. So, all around, this trinket is going to be a relatively weaker option in Season 4 than it was in Season 2. As such, its only uses are really going to be for situation-specific purposes in Raid, where you are at risk of dying to dot damage at range, and it's likely not going to be a strong option in Mythic Plus relative to Haste Trinkets, which provide much stronger throughput along with defensive uptime and a much stronger defensive cooldown. Reactive Defense Matrix is the last of the new options that are worth consideration. And, for all intents and purposes, Reactive Defense Matrix is a single target damage trinket that becomes stronger when you are regularly dipping below 20% health. However, it also becomes noticeably weaker if we go long periods of time without taking damage, since we need to be regularly taking damage in order for the trinket to get all of its procs, and in order for the reflect shields to be fully absorbed. And, as with anything that provides damage and healing in equal amounts, the overall healing is not the main selling point of this trinket. While this was a strong single target damage option back in Season 2, it is worth pointing out that, like Aegis, it also suffers from the problem of alternative trinkets being relatively stronger this season, since the tier set bonus makes our baseline damage much higher than it used to be. That being said, this still looks like it could be a respectable single target damage trinket in raids if you are regularly taking damage from the boss. However, there are a lot of fights where this won't be true for, and the mitigation benefits of this trinket are limited, so keep these two things in mind. As for Mythic Plus, Reactive Defense Matrix doesn't do a good job at providing the things we primarily want trinkets to do right now, which mainly includes helping with our defensive uptime or making us less likely to die to burst damage. It was used in Cutting Edge Keys back in Season 2 to eke out some more overall damage in dungeons that were very tight on time, though it's a lot more doubtful that it will even fulfill that role in Season 4, since it has a much smaller damage advantage over competing trinkets than it once had. As such, I think it's safe to say that it will generally be worse than Haste Trinkets in Mythic Plus in Season 4. Now that trinkets are taken care of, we are now going to take a look at our weapon options and how they are changing between the seasons. Compared to trinkets, weapons are in a simpler situation, and in Season 3, we are mostly choosing between standard secondary stat weapons and the jailer weapon that forgoes normal secondary stats in exchange for a unique on-use effect. As for normal weapons themselves, there is nothing special to say about them, since they follow normal itemization rules. So, the main question of concern in Season 3 is when we would want to consider using Gavel of the First Arbiter instead. Gavel of the First Arbiter is a unique on-use effect weapon that, instead of providing secondary stats, it provides you with the ability to gain a 1-minute duration buff on a 4-minute cooldown. Though it has a somewhat clunky activation condition since you often need to specifically target a spawn soul with an ability, or otherwise you need to wait for the soul to naturally die off after 30 seconds. Once you satisfy these conditions, you'll be granted one of 5 random buffs with damaging effects, with 3 buffs providing single target damage proc effects, and 2 buffs providing area of effect damage proc effects. All procs considered, the weapon ends up being around 25% stronger on single targets relative to multiple targets, relative to the damage that you yourself are doing, which means that it can be worth delaying the use of the weapon by up to a minute if it allows you to use it on a single target instead of on multiple targets. Many, but not all of the effects also provide some sort of defensive benefit, though the weapon is extremely unreliable if you are trying to use it explicitly for this reason. Still, the overall buff effects are extremely powerful to make up for the fact that you won't have one active for a majority of the time. If you want to read through all of the effect tooltips for yourself, I'm going to post them all on the screen for some amount of time if you would like to pause the video. Just keep in mind that they do not all have the same proc rate, and the numbers on these effects scale with the item level of the gavel you are using, among other things. Because much of the Jailer weapon's value is focused on its buff effect, Gavel of the First Arbiter's performance relative to normal weapons ends up being very timing dependent. For example, let us look at a graph of average buff uptime versus encounter length. While this buff effect only has 25% average uptime at really long fight durations, because the effect is front-loaded, you may be able to see much higher power from the Jailer weapon in shorter encounters and at specific timings. So, for example, the effect will be 4 times as strong in any encounter duration up to 1 minute in length, and you would receive 60% more than the long-term effect in a 5-minute encounter. Granted, if you are in a 4-minute encounter or an encounter that is particularly long, such as the length of an entire dungeon, your average uptime is going to be much closer to the steady state value of 25% uptime. Reality can make this a little more complicated with burn phases, forced downtime, and situations where it is better to hold your Jailer weapon cooldown rather than use it, but the general implication is the same. Timing is very impactful for the overall value of this weapon. With that in mind, a mythic Gavel of the First Arbiter provides enough of a damage advantage that it is reasonable to consider it as the best weapon in Season 3 for all content types. Even if the non-damage benefits are not worthwhile, it is basically going to increase your damage by at least 1000 DPS in all situations over the best non-gavel weapon, which is a trade-off a lot of people are willing to take, even when doing content where damage isn't particularly important. That being said, the picture isn't nearly as clean-cut when we take a look at versions of the gavel below Mythic difficulty, assuming the player has a competitive alternative such as a well-statted 278 item level weapon. In this situation, the damage advantage of Gavel is going to be much less significant unless your encounter ends on a good timing for the weapon, or if there is some raid encounter dynamic going on that makes the weapon more valuable during limited portions of the raid encounter, in particular, that you can take advantage of with your buff windows. So, without an advantage like this, the extra non-damage benefits of having an item level 278 normal weapon are a lot more comparable to the now small damage benefit you would gain from a 272 gavel. Given this, I still think it's likely that a 272 gavel can generate enough extra value during a typical raid encounter to justify using over another 278 item level weapon, due to the shorter encounter durations and fight designs with some phases that are more significant than others. But for a majority of players, this is likely not true in your average Mythic Plus dungeon, where the conditions aren't nearly as preferable to Gavel as they are in Raid. In Season 4, we are mostly looking at a similar situation, except now we have one additional option that saw use in Season 2, Jaethus, the Prison Blade. Jaethus is a bit peculiar, since there are technically 6 variations of the weapon depending on how much you decide to feed it. But for most purposes this season, I'll be assuming you feed it 4 times, which removes 80% of its secondary stats for a single target damage proc that also provides strength. This is your typical random proc effect, so there are no weird dynamics going on like you have with the Jailer weapon. And, unlike the Jailer weapon, we are allowed to freely swap this weapon during active encounters. After looking in depth at the Jailer weapon and Jaethus at identical item levels, Jaethus appears to do very similar overall damage to Gavel of the First Arbiter's damage under steady state conditions. Said another way, Gavel of the First Arbiter only outdamages Jaethus when there is some way to generate extra value out of its proc effects. So, in raid encounters, this likely makes Jaethus worse than Gavel. But in Mythic Plus, the performance is going to be very similar, except with the added benefits of Jaethus having more consistent benefits, being weapon swappable, and not having to worry about satisfying the activation conditions of Gavel, which can be very annoying in certain dungeon pulls. All in all, I think the case could be made that Jaethus would perform better overall than Gavel in these circumstances, that they are looking close enough numbers-wise that I would chalk it up to players' preference at the end of the day. In conclusion, this video reviewed how Season 4 is different from normal seasons, how itemization changes could affect how you want to play the game, how the trinkets situation is going to be changing with the introduction of Season 4, and how the weapons situation will be changing moving into Season 4. If you would like to make it easier for other Blood Death Knights to find this content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, if there are any additional topics you'd like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own about Season 4, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.